Hey guys, today we're peeling back the layers of history, not just metaphorically, but quite literally. Imagine, if you will, the biting wind whipping across an open savanna, the sun, though distant, still beating down with an unforgiving intensity, or perhaps the chilling damp of a primeval cave, the kind where every rustle of dry leaves sounds like something with very sharp teeth. You're there, a very early you, shivering, perhaps swatting at prehistoric mosquitoes the size of small birds, and wondering, deep in your ancient brain, is this it? Is this all there is to life? Just exposed? Because, let's be honest, without the glorious inventions we now take for granted, like, say, a simple pair of pants, you probably wouldn't have made it past, lunchtime in the Pleistocene. Survival was, shall we say, a full-contact sport, and your skin, while charmingly supple, was hardly built for extreme weather or unexpected encounters with thorny bushes. So cast your mind back, way back, to a time before even the wildest dreams of denim. You're standing on the cusp of something monumental, not the invention of the wheel, not even fire, but something far more personal, more intimately connected to your very comfort, and let's be honest, your modesty. Our journey begins with the absolute basics, the unglamorous but utterly essential first steps in human attire. Before anyone even conceived of a pant leg, clothing wasn't about style points or making a statement. It was about not getting eaten, not freezing to death, and not acquiring an unfortunate rash from a venomous plant. You'd find yourself foraging, perhaps stumbling through dense undergrowth, your bare skin a prime target for everything from biting insects to jagged rocks. Your ancestors, bless their hardy souls, quickly figured out that the hides of the animals they hunted, or let's be realistic, scavenged, weren't just for dinner. They were insulation, a flexible shield against the elements. Picture yourself, perhaps, draped in a roughly cured animal skin, stiff and smelling faintly of, well, whatever that animal was doing before it met its untimely end. It's not soft, it's not particularly comfortable, and it definitely chafes in all the wrong places, but oh, the warmth. The sheer life-saving warmth it provides as the sun dips below the horizon and the temperature plummets. You're no longer just shivering, you're surviving. The initial approach to clothing was, shall we say, functional chic. You'd simply wrap a large hide around your torso, perhaps securing it with a strip of raw sinew or a piece of tough vine. Think of it less as tailoring and more as drape and hope. There were no seams, no patterns, just the raw material and the desperate need to cover up. This rudimentary covering protected you from the sun's harsh rays during the day, preventing brutal sunburn that could cripple your ability to hunt or gather. At night, it was a crucial barrier against the cold. And let's not forget the purely pragmatic benefit of keeping sharp thorns and biting ants from making direct contact with your delicate flesh. It was, in essence, your earliest form of personal protective equipment, predating hard hats by a few million years. As you moved from place to place, following migrating herds or seeking new food sources, the limitations of simple drapes became painfully clear. A sudden gust of wind could leave you exposed. A vigorous chase after prey could result in your carefully wrapped hide slipping off. And don't even get started on the indignity of squatting for natural reasons while trying to maintain your dignity with a single, unwieldy pelt. This is where the ingenuity of our ancient relatives truly began to shine, albeit very dimly at first. They started to realize that if they processed these hides, scraping them clean with flint tools, softening them by chewing or beating, perhaps even smoking them over a fire, they became more pliable, less likely to rot, and far more adaptable. This early hide preparation, a mainstream historical fact, is evidenced by the discovery of stone scrapers and bone awls dating back hundreds of thousands of years. These weren't just for cleaning meat. They were the first tools of the fashion industry, crude as it was. Consider the sheer determination. You're not just making a coat, you're engaging in a multi-day, labor-intensive process, likely shared by your small, interdependent group. The sun is your dryer, the rocks are your mallets, and your teeth are, well, let's just say they got a good workout. The smell, I imagine, would have been distinct. Forget new car smell. This was recently deceased woolly mammoth fragrance. But this was survival, remember? And the payoff was worth it. A garment that, while still primitive, offered significantly better protection than nothing at all. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some scholars theorize that early human clothing wasn't just for protection, but also for camouflage. Imagine trying to sneak up on a wary deer. If your skin is bright against the muted tones of the savanna, you're basically a giant beacon. Draping yourself in animal hides, particularly those of the animals you were hunting, might have helped you blend into the environment, making you less conspicuous to your dinner. It's a bit like wearing a ghillie suit made from saber-toothed tiger fur, which, let's be honest, sounds both terrifying and incredibly cool. Whether it was a conscious, tactical choice or merely a happy accident of using available materials, it certainly adds another layer to the story of early attire. Yet, even with these advancements, clothing remained largely unstructured. It was about covering the largest surface area with the least amount of effort. You'd see a lot of variation depending on the climate. In warmer regions, perhaps just a simple loincloth made from broad leaves or softened bark, offering minimal protection from the sun and insects. In colder climes, it was all about layering, with multiple hides providing insulation. Historians still argue whether the earliest humans developed distinct garment types, or if it was more of a regional, material-dependent adaptation. Was there a conceptual leap to this is a coat versus this is just a hide I'm wearing? The archaeological record, as helpful as it is, rarely comes with tiny labels indicating seasonal collection. And this brings us back to you, shivering by a primitive fire, wrapped in something that vaguely resembles a discarded rug. You've got warmth, yes, and you're less likely to be impaled by a stray branch. But mobility, not so much. The idea of tailoring, of cutting and sewing fabric to fit the contours of the human body was still light years away. You're bundled, not dressed. Every movement is a minor wrestling match with your crude attire. Try running from a grumpy cave bear in a single, stiff hide, and you'll quickly appreciate the evolutionary pressure for something better. Something that allows you to move, to hunt, to gather, without constant fear of your entire outfit plummeting to your ankles at the most inopportune moment. The seeds of pants, though utterly invisible at this point, were being sown in the discomfort of those very first, very basic coverings. Your journey to comfortable legwear has only just begun. Survival in harsh climates. Discuss how cold environments spurred early innovations in covering legs. You shiver, hunched against a biting wind that whips across an unforgiving tundra. The air bites at your exposed skin, not just a nip, but a deep, bone-aching chill that promises frostbite with every breath. Your fingers, raw and numb, ache as you desperately try to rub some warmth back into them. The landscape stretches out, a monochrome canvas of white and gray, and the sun, a pale, distant orb, offers no comfort. You pull your flimsy hide wrap tighter, but it's a futile gesture. Your legs, especially, feel like solid blocks of ice, protesting with every step you force yourself to take. This isn't just a bad hair day, my friend. This is the kind of cold that strips away your optimism, then your sensation, then your very ability to move. You look down at your bare shins, purpling, and you know with a chilling certainty that you probably won't survive this unless something drastic changes. And by something drastic, I don't mean a stronger cup of coffee. I mean you need to put some pants on. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we talked about? Well, while ingenious in its own way, that was more of a tropical innovation. Now you're not worried about sunburn, are you? You're worried about losing toes. You've moved. Your ancestors, bold and curious, didn't stay put in the warm, cozy cradles of Africa. Oh no, they had wanderlust and an insatiable desire to see what was over the next hill, even if that hill turned out to be covered in snow and inhabited by woolly mammoths with an attitude. This grand migration, a slow, generational shuffle, pushed early humans into environments that were, frankly, less than hospitable. Think about it. Leaving the sun-drenched plains where a loincloth and some cleverly applied, perhaps aromatic animal byproduct was all you needed for a world where the very air could kill you. It's like trading a beach vacation for a research trip to the Arctic Circle, except without the heated research station and the perfectly brewed artisanal hot chocolate. The problem wasn't just overall body warmth, which, frankly, you could mitigate to some degree by simply piling on more and more animal hides until you resembled a particularly shaggy, furry, walking haystack. No, the real conundrum, the anatomical Achilles heel, if you will, was your legs. Legs are particularly vulnerable to cold. They're long, they have a lot of surface area, and they're essential for movement, something you really need to do when you're trying to outrun a saber-toothed cat, or just find some firewood before nightfall. Simple wraps like a skirt or a kilt of hide offered some protection to the upper leg. But the lower leg, the shins, the calves, those remained exposed, susceptible to frostbite, scratches from underbrush and general misery. Imagine, just for a moment, trying to hunt in deep, drifting snow, the kind that swallows your lower legs whole, with nothing but your bare skin to face the biting frost. It's not just profoundly uncomfortable. It's a direct, almost aggressive invitation to a hypothermic party you definitely, unequivocally, do not want to attend. Your exposed flesh would quickly go numb, then painful, then numb again, a sure sign of trouble brewing. Historians still argue whether the initial drive for leg coverings was primarily warmth or protection from the elements during hunting and foraging. So, necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention, and Mother Nature, in her infinite wisdom, provided the raw materials. Animal hides. You see a fallen reindeer, a particularly shaggy cave bear, or perhaps a rather unfortunate musk ox. You've got your stone tools, sharpened flakes of flint, bone awls. Processing these hides was a monumental task, by the way. It wasn't just peel and wear. Oh no. You had to scrape off the flesh, remove the hair, then soften it, often by pounding, chewing, or treating it with things like animal brains or fats. Sounds delicious, right? Imagine the smell. Your average fashion blogger would probably faint on the spot, but it resulted in a durable, flexible material. And then the brilliant leap. Instead of just wrapping a hide around your waist like a primitive toga, what if you could shape it? What if you could make something that actually enclosed your legs? The very first iterations weren't what you'd call trousers in the modern sense. Forget zippers, pockets, or even a waistband that stays up without a struggle. We're talking about basic, unrefined tubes, often fashioned from two separate pieces of hide, painstakingly cut, and then perhaps crudely bound together with tough sinew or thin, prepared strips of leather. Think of them less as the impeccably tailored trousers you might slip into today, and more as a pair of extremely determined, rather ambitious leg warmers, struggling to become something more. These early leg coverings weren't tailored, not in the sense we understand tailoring today. You weren't measuring your inseam or worrying about a flattering cut. You were worrying about staying alive. They were often crudely cut, designed to be pulled up and tied or held in place by a belt or straps around the waist. Sometimes they were more like separate leggings, reaching from the ankle to the hip, pulled up over a simple loincloth. The challenge was making them stay on and providing enough freedom of movement. Imagine trying to run a marathon, or perhaps more accurately, navigate a particularly challenging obstacle course, while wearing two very stubborn, rather ill-fitting sacks on your lower limbs. Not exactly conducive to a speedy getaway, and certainly not what you'd call aerodynamic. This was a painstakingly slow, incredibly iterative process, driven by countless rounds of trial and error, exacerbated by freezing fingers, numbed dexterity, and probably punctuated by a whole lot of frustrated grunts and involuntary shivers as solutions were sought in the bitter cold. The invention of rudimentary leg coverings, even if just basic tubes of hide, was a massive evolutionary step. It wasn't just about comfort, it was about extending your operational range. You could venture further into colder territories, exploit new hunting grounds, and survive long, bitter winters. It meant you could endure prolonged exposure to the elements, track prey through deeper snow, and simply exist in environments that would have been insurmountable before. This wasn't a sudden eureka moment, mind you, where someone just woke up and declared, "Behold the pant!" It was a gradual evolution, intertwined with the development of better tools for hide processing, more sophisticated hunting techniques, and a deeper understanding of thermal insulation. The very act of living in a cold place forced innovation, pushing human ingenuity to find solutions to very immediate, very uncomfortable problems. It laid the groundwork piece by piece, sinew by sinew, for the future of lower body fashion, moving you further and further away from the glorious, albeit chilly, freedom of the naked leg. It wasn't about style, it was about survival. And if you're picturing an early human trying on different shades of mastodon hide, well, you're probably getting a little too far ahead of yourself. Stick to the basic brown, okay. It's practical. The mobility imperative. Examine how active nomadic lifestyles led to practical garment choices. You're tracking a herd across the vast, undulating plains, the wind whipping at your face, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant promise. Each step you take is a deliberate calculation, a dance between balance and momentum. Your muscles hum with the rhythm of movement, the ground beneath your feet, a shifting canvas of grass, rock, and sudden dips. You crouch low, peering through the tall stalks, then spring up, heart pounding as the herd shifts direction, forcing you to adjust, to run, to scramble over fallen logs, to slide down muddy banks. Your breath comes in ragged gasps, the cold air burning your lungs, but there's no time to rest, no luxury of stopping. Survival hinges on your ability to move, to adapt, to chase down sustenance, or to escape a very large, very hungry predator that views you as little more than a crunchy snack. This isn't a stroll in the park with your dog. No, this is the relentless, unforgiving reality of a nomadic existence, where every sunrise brings a new journey, and every sunset finds you far from where you began. Mobility, my friend, isn't just a convenience. It's the very bedrock of your continued existence. Remember that basic hide you wrapped around yourself, or the cleverly draped plant fibers that offered a modicum of warmth. They were fine for sheltering from a mild breeze or sun, perhaps even offering a touch of modest protection when you were simply huddled by a fire. But try running at full tilt, scrambling up a rocky incline, or navigating dense undergrowth while wearing what essentially amounts to a fashionable, albeit impractical, toga made of animal skin. You'd quickly find yourself tangled, tripped, or more likely, completely exposed as your carefully arranged fabric decided to make a break for it at the most inopportune moment. Imagine attempting to hunt a swift deer or outmaneuver a saber-toothed cat with your vital bits flapping in the breeze, snagging on every branch. You probably won't survive this, dear listener, because a wardrobe malfunction in this era is less about embarrassment and more about becoming dinner. The simple, unsewn garments of earlier times, while revolutionary for their moment, were inherently limiting for a life on the move. They provided basic coverage, yes, but they hindered agility, restricted stride, and offered insufficient protection against the myriad scrapes, thorns, and sharp rocks that came with a truly active lifestyle. You couldn't just exist in these environments. You had to thrive through constant motion. So, as you became more adept at hunting, gathering, and migrating across vast distances, the need for something more form-fitting became incredibly apparent. Picture early humans, perhaps in the frigid steppes of Eurasia, observing how animal pelts could be shaped, how strips of hide could be laced together. This wasn't about fashion, it was about efficiency. The mainstream historical fact here is that the earliest evidence of sewn garments, including those that likely covered legs, dates back over 30,000 years, found in sites like Sungir in Russia, where meticulously crafted mammoth ivory beads adorned what appear to be trousers and tunics. It suggests a sophisticated understanding of tailoring and the critical need for insulated, close-fitting attire. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some anthropologists theorize that the initial inspiration for leg coverings might have come not just from warmth, but from the need to protect the inner thighs and groin from abrasion during long walks or rides on rudimentary pack animals. Imagine the chafing. While horses weren't yet domesticated for riding in this earliest period, other animals could have been used, or simply the repetitive motion of bipedal travel over rough terrain would have made such protection invaluable. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for pants was warmth, protection from abrasion, or simply the superior freedom of movement they offered compared to skirts or kilts. Regardless, the seed was planted. The idea of separating and encapsulating each leg, creating two distinct tubes for motion, began to take hold. It wasn't quite the snug denim you're picturing, more like two fur tubes tied at the waist, but hey, baby steps, right? Or perhaps, in this case, baby strides. You feel the raw, scratchy hide pressing against your inner thighs, each rhythmic bounce of the horse a fresh, searing agony. The wind, once a gentle caress, now whips past, chilling your exposed skin, and the sun, high above the vast, open plains, bakes the back of your calves while thorns from low-lying scrub reach out like tiny, malevolent fingers to snag and prick. This, my friend, is the unvarnished reality of early horseback riding without a scrap of decent leg protection. Frankly, if you tried to ride bareback across the Eurasian steppe for more than a couple of hours, enduring the sheer chafing, the stinging cold, and the constant nips of nature, you'd probably be walking like a cowboy who just lost a very personal wrestling match for the rest of your life. Or, more likely, not walking at all. It's a harsh truth, but comfort was not just a luxury. It was a fundamental prerequisite for survival in this new, rapidly moving world. Remember how we talked about humans finding ways to cover themselves for basic protection, then for warmth in truly punishing cold. And finally, for the sheer demands of a constantly moving, nomadic life. Well, imagine all those imperatives suddenly being dialed up to 11. For millennia, humanity had been largely earthbound, walking, running, sometimes climbing, but always anchored to the ground. Your early human ancestors, the ones who perhaps wrapped themselves in animal hides and later fashioned rudimentary leg coverings for warmth, never truly anticipated the revolution that was about to literally gallop into their lives. The domestication of the horse, a process historians still debate, began around 3,500 to 3,000 BCE, most likely in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, fundamentally reshaped human existence. It wasn't just about getting from point A to point B faster. It was about hunting more efficiently, migrating further, conquering new territories, and connecting distant cultures in ways previously unimaginable. But this newfound freedom on horseback came with a rather immediate, rather painful wardrobe crisis. Your simple loincloth, perhaps even the early forms of leg wraps we discussed, those were fine for trundling along on your own 2 feet. But perch yourself atop a powerful, moving animal for hours on end, and you quickly discover their glaring inadequacies. The edges of your tunic would flap wildly, offering zero protection from the wind or the errant branch. A wrapped hide, while better than nothing, would inevitably bunch, twist, and unravel, leaving the most vulnerable areas of your inner thighs and knees exposed to the constant friction of the horse's flank. This wasn't just uncomfortable, it was debilitating. Severe chafing could lead to open sores, infections, and quite literally sideline a rider, making them an easy target for predators or rival tribes. Imagine trying to lead a raid or escape a charging mammoth while wincing with every stride because your primitive leg coverings have failed you spectacularly. Not exactly peak performance, is it? This necessity, as they say, was the mother of a truly groundbreaking invention. The trousers, or at least the proto-trousers that would eventually evolve into the ubiquitous garment we know today. The first clear archaeological evidence of garments that resemble modern trousers comes from the Tarim Basin in western China, specifically from the Yonghai tombs, dating back to between 13th and 10th centuries BCE. These finds include woolen trousers, clearly designed for riding, unearthed with the remains of steppe nomads. This mainstream historical fact points directly to the equestrian revolution as the driving force behind the design and widespread adoption of leg coverings that were distinct from mere wraps. These weren't just tubes of fabric. They were sewn, shaped, and fitted, often with crotches designed to accommodate the rider's posture. Now, for a quirky little tidbit that adds to the flavor of this sartorial shift. While these nomadic horse riders were embracing the comfort and practicality of trousers, many settled, civilized cultures, particularly the Greeks and later the Romans, absolutely despised them. They viewed trousers as the barbaric attire of uncivilized peoples, the Scythians, the Gauls, the Germans. Can you imagine the fashionistas of ancient Athens scoffing at some heavily armored barbarian, snuggled comfortably in his felt trousers, while they swished around in their flowing chitons, probably tripping over themselves every other step? It's a bit like someone today sneering at your hiking boots, while they teeter around in stilettos on a muddy trail. Different strokes for different folks, I suppose, especially when one stroke involves staying firmly in the saddle. The design innovations weren't just about protection from chafing. Trousers provided crucial insulation against bitter winds and biting cold, especially during long journeys across vast, treeless steppes. They also offered a barrier against thorny bushes and the irritating bites of insects that thrive in tall grasses. Furthermore, they protected riders from the sun's harsh UV rays, preventing debilitating sunburn, which, remember, was a constant concern for your ancestors who, in many cases, probably didn't have access to crocodile dung sunscreen. This specialized clothing allowed riders to endure longer journeys, extend their hunting ranges, and operate more effectively in battle. Without the freedom of movement and the protection afforded by trousers, the horseback riding revolution simply couldn't have achieved its full transformative potential. The ability to ride for days on end, to maneuver quickly, and to fight effectively from horseback meant a decisive advantage for those who adopted this new form of locomotion, and crucially, its accompanying wardrobe. Historians still argue whether the invention of specialized riding trousers was a gradual adaptation across various cultures, or if it originated from a single, innovative group, like the Scythians, and then spread rapidly across the Eurasian steppe due to their undeniable practical benefits. Regardless of its precise origin point, the necessity was universal for anyone wanting to truly harness the power of the horse. This wasn't just fashion, it was survival gear. Feel the biting wind whip around your bare legs as you sit astride a galloping horse, the rough hide chafing against your skin with every powerful stride. You're not just enduring a brisk autumn day in the park, oh no. You're on the vast, unforgiving steppes of Central Asia, thousands of years ago, where the wind doesn't just nip. It tries to sever limbs, and the ground, well, let's just say it's not exactly velvet. In this landscape, without the right gear, you probably won't survive this journey, much less the winter. Remember that feeling of liberation you found when you first learned to ride, soaring across the plains. Now imagine that same exhilarating speed, but with the added joy of frostbite creeping up your thighs. Not quite the same, is it? This, my sleepy friend, is the crucible where true legwear ingenuity was forged. The nomadic peoples of the Central Asian steppes, a vast expanse of grasslands stretching from Ukraine to Mongolia, were not just skilled equestrians. They were pragmatists forced by their environment to innovate. Their lives were a constant ballet of movement herding livestock, following seasonal pastures, trading, and occasionally, engaging in a little cross-border negotiation, often at sword point. To do all that, perched atop a horse for hours on end, day after day, in temperatures that swung from blistering hot to eye-wateringly cold, something had to give. And that something was the flappy, drafty, utterly impractical skirt or kilt. Imagine trying to manage a herd of unruly sheep, or worse, even more unruly horses, while your lower half is battling a gust of wind determined to turn your modest tunic into a parachute. Or perhaps you're trying to draw a bow, leaning precariously from your saddle, only for your flowing garment to snag on something vital. It's not just a fashion faux pas, it's a tactical blunder. Clearly, a revolution in leg coverings was needed, and it was here, amongst these highly mobile, horse-dependent societies, that it took root. The true breakthrough, the moment when legs finally got their individual freedom, came from the realization that if you wanted to ride comfortably and efficiently, your legs needed to be treated as separate entities, not as one big bundle. You needed something that moved with you, clung to your form, and offered protection from both the elements and the constant friction of the saddle. So, they started to craft what we now recognize as the earliest functional trousers. And when I say functional, I mean genuinely functional, not just a pair of leggings you might wear for your trendy yoga class, though those probably evolved from this, funnily enough. One of the most remarkable pieces of evidence for this ingenious leap comes from the frozen graves of the Tarim Basin in present-day Xinjiang, China, specifically the Yanghai tombs. Here, archaeologists unearthed, among other incredible artifacts, a pair of trousers dating back an astounding 3,000 to 3,300 years. This makes them, as far as we know, the oldest existing trousers in the world. Now imagine a pair of pants that old. They've seen some things, haven't they? Probably have more stories than your average history textbook. These weren't just simple tubes of fabric. Oh no, these ancient sartorial masterpieces were complexly constructed. They featured 3 distinct pieces, 2 legs and a crotch insert, specifically designed to allow for comfortable horseback riding. The fabric itself was woven, often from wool, and sometimes even incorporated intricate patterns. Think about that for a second. 3,000 years ago, someone wasn't just throwing a piece of cloth around their waist. They were engineering a garment for a specific, demanding purpose. They had to figure out how to cut the fabric to allow for movement, how to sew seams that wouldn't chafe, and how to create a central gusset that would prevent tearing under pressure. It's like they invented ergonomic seating, but for your legs, while on the move. Historians still argue whether this invention was a singular flash of genius in one specific steppe culture, or if similar designs developed independently across various nomadic groups who faced similar environmental and lifestyle challenges. Was it a moment of shared necessity sparking parallel innovations? Or did the idea slowly spread along the vast trade routes and migratory paths that crisscrossed Central Asia? It's a fascinating chicken and egg situation, only with more horses and fewer actual chickens. These early trousers, often made of felted wool or woven animal hair, weren't just for warmth. They were armor against the elements, a second skin for the nomadic warrior and herder. They offered unparalleled freedom of movement, preventing chafing and providing crucial insulation against the bitter cold. They were the ultimate athleisure wear of their time, perfectly suited for a life lived largely in the saddle. Without the ingenuity of these steppe nomads, we might still be stuck trying to ride a horse in a toga. And honestly, that just sounds like a wardrobe malfunction waiting to happen every single time. Their solution was so effective, so perfectly tailored to their needs, that it quickly spread, fundamentally changing human attire and paving the way for trousers to become the universal garment they are today. Scythian fashion statement. You feel the biting wind whip across your face, a raw, untamed force that threatens to pluck the very breath from your lungs. It's a wind that has swept across vast, treeless plains for millennia, shaping the very landscape and the lives of those who dared to call it home. Your fingers, though accustomed to the chill, tingle with the cold as you grip the rough mane of your sturdy steppe pony. The rhythmic thud of hooves on packed earth is a constant companion, a lullaby of movement that has defined existence here for generations. Ahead, the horizon stretches endlessly, a muted palette of browns and grays under an immense, indifferent sky. This is not a place for the faint of heart, nor for flimsy attire. If you showed up here in, say, a toga, well, you probably wouldn't survive this for more than an afternoon. Exposure wouldn't even be your primary concern. Laughter from the locals, followed swiftly by a lecture on practical fashion choices, would be your immediate downfall. This harsh, yet strangely beautiful, theater is where our story gallops forward, directly into the saddle with the Scythians. Remember those early innovators, those intrepid individuals grappling with the challenge of covering their legs in cold environments and for active nomadic lives. Well, the Scythians, a confederation of nomadic tribes that dominated the Eurasian steppe from the 9th to the 1st century BCE, didn't just grapple with it. They grabbed the concept by the reins and wrote it into the annals of history as arguably the most prominent early adopters of proto-pants. They weren't just wearing something on their legs. They were wearing integrated, functional leg coverings designed for a life lived largely atop a horse. Imagine their days. You are riding for hours, perhaps days on end, herding livestock, hunting game, or engaging in the occasional spirited skirmish with a rival tribe. Your legs, exposed to the elements, would be chafed raw by the horse's flanks, frozen by the wind, or scorched by the sun. Long cloaks or simple wraps, while offering some protection, were simply impractical when your primary mode of transport and warfare involved staying firmly seated on a galloping beast. This is where the Scythians truly excelled in sartorial innovation. They needed freedom of movement, protection from the elements, and something that wouldn't get tangled or snagged while moving at speed. Their answer: trousers. Not just any trousers, but tailored garments that embraced the leg, often made from sturdy felted wool, leather, or woven fabrics, sometimes intricately decorated. When you look at the archaeological evidence, particularly from the frozen burial mounds of the Prejdice culture in Siberia, a closely related group to the Scythians, preserved as if by some ancient, icy magic, you can practically feel the texture of their clothing. These are not just remnants. They are fashion statements from millennia past. You can see the distinct shape of their trousers, often relatively close-fitting around the lower leg, sometimes flaring slightly at the ankle, and often wider in the hip and thigh area to allow for ease of movement while straddling a horse. Some even had foot coverings integrated into the trousers themselves, almost like a full-body onesie for your lower half, ensuring maximum warmth and minimal drafts. It's like they invented the concept of athleisure wear about 2,500 years before Lululemon even dreamt of a yoga mat. Just picture the look on their faces if you tried to explain a yoga mat to them. These trousers weren't merely practical. They were also a canvas for cultural expression. The Prejdice finds reveal trousers adorned with vibrant geometric patterns, animal motifs, and even stylized human figures, often created through intricate applique work or embroidery. It wasn't just about survival. It was about style, about announcing who you were to the vast, open world. You weren't just a rider. You were a Scythian rider, resplendent in your distinctly practical and remarkably fashionable legwear. It makes you wonder if they had their own version of fashion weeks. Perhaps a highly competitive annual, best-dressed nomad competition, judged solely by how many hours you could comfortably spend on horseback without getting saddle sores. Now, while the Scythians are celebrated for their embrace and popularization of trousers, historians still argue whether they were the absolute first to conceive of this garment. Was it an independent invention born of necessity on the vast steppes? Or did they adapt an earlier form of leg covering from even more ancient peoples further to the east or west? The archaeological record, as you might imagine, is rarely a perfectly clear-cut narrative. What is clear, however, is that the Scythians were masters of equestrian culture, and their adoption of trousers was a pivotal moment in human clothing history. They made trousers cool, literally and figuratively, spreading the idea across their vast networks of trade and conquest. Imagine a Scythian warrior, resplendent in his comfortable yet stylish trousers, confidently riding past a group of toga-clad Roman dignitaries. One might even hear a faint whisper carried on the wind. "Check out those gladiators, still wearing skirts." The sheer practicality for their nomadic, horseback-riding lifestyle made trousers an undeniable advantage, a true game-changer in how humans clothed themselves for active lives. Imagine the silence, broken only by the whisper of the desert wind. You stand on the edge of what feels like a moonscape, the Taklamakan, a vast expanse of sand and salt. This isn't just any desert. It's a time capsule, a desiccated embrace for secrets thousands of years old. And you, my friend, if you were actually out here, you probably wouldn't survive this particular brand of desolate beauty without a very good guide, and probably a camel. But in your mind's eye, you're fine. You're here to witness a quiet revelation, one that changes our entire understanding of who first slipped into something more comfortable and, crucially, more practical than a tunic. Remember those Scythians galloping across the steppes, their proto-pants a testament to their equestrian life. Well, imagine if we could rewind even further to find even older, remarkably preserved evidence. That's what happened in the heart of what's now Xinjiang, China, within the arid confines of the Tarim Basin. Here, in burial sites scattered across this ancient crossroads, something incredible emerged from the sand. Mummified remains, not wrapped like Egyptian pharaohs, but naturally preserved by the incredibly dry air and saline soil. These aren't just any mummies. These are fashion statements from the Bronze Age. You lean in closer, peering at the remains of someone who lived over 3 millennia ago. The details are astonishing. The hair, the facial features, even the texture of their skin miraculously intact. But your gaze naturally drifts down, because there on these ancient bodies are pants. Real, honest-to-goodness trousers. Not just scraps of fabric, but expertly woven garments, tailored for movement. This isn't the simple loincloth or the flowing skirt we've often associated with early human attire. This is sophisticated tailoring, an undeniable declaration that someone, somewhere, figured out that 2 separate tubes for your legs were a significant upgrade. One of the most famous examples, often referred to as the yarn-wrapped mummy, discovered in the Yanghai tombs near Turpan, wore a pair of trousers made of wool. And when I say wool, don't picture your itchy Christmas sweater from Aunt Mildred. This was refined stuff. The craftsmanship is mind-boggling for its age. These aren't just seams. We're talking about complex patterns woven directly to fit the shape of the body, complete with separate leg sections, a crotch panel, and even ankle ties. It's the kind of complex textile work that makes you wonder if they had tiny, ancient sewing machines, or just an incredible amount of patience and extremely nimble fingers. Historians still argue whether the complexity of these early textiles implies a pre-existing, advanced weaving tradition, or if necessity truly was the mother of invention in the most extreme sense here. Think about that for a second. We're talking about a garment so perfectly suited for riding a horse that it remained virtually unchanged in its core design for thousands of years. These people, the Tocharians as they are often called, weren't just wearing pants. They were essentially wearing the blueprint for your favorite jeans, just a few millennia earlier and made of wool. The mainstream historical fact here is undeniable. The discovery of these Tarim Basin mummies, particularly the ones at Yanghai, pushes back the confirmed date of tailor-made trousers by several centuries, placing them firmly in the 2nd millennium BCE, around 13th to 10th century BCE. This isn't just a fashion note in the dusty annals of history. It's a testament to adaptation and innovation. Imagine the conversations. Bartholomew, darling, this tunic is simply not cutting it when I'm trying to chase down a gazelle at full gallop. My legs are getting mighty cold and frankly chafed. Surely there's a better way. And Bartholomew, perhaps after a few attempts involving highly impractical leg warmers, finally hits upon the two-legged solution. The quirky tidbit. Some of these Tarim Basin pants weren't just functional, they were decorative. They featured stripes and complex patterns, suggesting that even then, people understood the concept of dressing to impress, or at least, dressing to not look like you just rolled out of a mud pit. You know, the usual human need to add a bit of flair. The preservation of these textiles is, in itself, a marvel. The dry desert air acted like nature's deep freeze, preventing decay and holding onto delicate fibers for eons. It's why we have so much information, not just about their clothing, but their diet, their health, even their genetic makeup. They were a diverse group, connecting east and west, and their attire reflects this nomadic, horseback-riding lifestyle that demanded freedom of movement. Remember how crucial mobility was for early humans, always on the move, hunting, gathering, evading predators. Well, add horseback riding to that list, and suddenly the need for something that stayed put and protected your inner thighs became paramount. These finds directly support the idea we've been exploring, that the practical demands of equestrian life, particularly in the vast open spaces of the Central Asian steppes, were the primary drivers for the invention and adoption of pants. While early forms of leg coverings certainly existed, wraps, leggings, simple stitched hides, these Tarim Basin examples represent fully articulated, purpose-built trousers. They weren't an accident, they were an invention. A revolutionary one, in fact, that allowed for greater agility, warmth, and protection while mounted. It's almost as if someone said, "You know what? This single piece of fabric draped around my lower half is just not providing the necessary aerodynamic qualities for my high-speed pursuit of dinner." And thus, the bifurcated garment was born. You can almost hear the soft rustle of their wool as they moved, the faint scent of ancient dust clinging to the fibers. These pants weren't just practical. They were also incredibly durable, designed to withstand the rigors of nomadic life. The wool was tightly spun and densely woven, indicating a deep understanding of textile engineering. And if you think your modern running gear is impressive, imagine crafting something like this with only rudimentary tools, relying on generations of passed-down knowledge. It's enough to make you appreciate the simple convenience of off-the-rack clothing, isn't it? No need to spend months weaving your next pair of trousers. Unless you're into that sort of artisanal, historically accurate cosplay, which, hey, no judgment here. So, as you drift deeper into the soft hum of history, remember the Tarim Basin mummies. They aren't just ancient bodies. They are silent witnesses to a pivotal moment in human ingenuity. They tell us that long before fashionistas graced the runways, there were practical innovators in the heart of Asia, carefully crafting garments that would literally shape human mobility and interaction for millennia to come. The Scythians might have popularized them, but the threads of this story stretch back even further, into the very dust from which these first pants emerged. You're standing on sun-baked marble, the scent of olive oil and something vaguely floral wafting on the breeze. The forum bustles around you, a symphony of sandals slapping stone and the murmur of Latin. Sunlight glints off the polished bronze of a senator's toga, draped with an almost artistic nonchalance. Everywhere you look, it's flowing fabrics, bare legs, and a confidence in the human form that borders on exhibitionism. Remember those Scythians galloping across the steppes in their practical, sturdy trousers, perfectly designed for a life lived astride a horse. Well, cast your gaze here to the heart of the Roman Empire, and you'll find a stark contrast. Here, the very idea of encasing your legs in anything resembling what we call pants is met with a shudder, a sneer, and perhaps even a philosophical treatise on the decline of civilization. You see a young patrician adjusting his tunic, a look of profound disdain crossing his face as he gestures towards a distant, cloaked figure, likely a newly arrived merchant from Gaul. "Barbarian," you hear him mutter, the word dripping with contempt, and you know without a shadow of a doubt he's not just talking about the man's origin, but the ridiculous, form-obscuring leggings he's sporting. It's a full-body judgment, a societal statement etched into the very fabric of their clothing or lack thereof, where legs are concerned. For the Greeks and Romans, trousers in any form were the ultimate sartorial sin, a clear marker of the uncivilized, the unrefined, the utterly unclassical. Think about it. The Greeks, with their obsession with athletic prowess, the idealized human form, and the beauty of the naked body in their sculptures and gymnasia. To them, covering up the legs with something baggy and shapeless was an affront to both aesthetics and philosophy. It suggested a hiding, a lack of confidence in one's physique, or worse, a need for protection from elements that truly civilized people simply endured with stoic grace. They valued fluidity, freedom of movement in their flowing chitons and peplos. Pants in their eyes were constricting, awkward, and frankly, a bit vulgar. They were for the rough and tumble, the grunting tribes beyond the borders, not for the eloquent orators of the agora. And the Romans, practical as they were in so many aspects of life, inherited this cultural bias. Their iconic toga was a symbol of citizenship, a garment of immense dignity that required considerable effort to drape just so. It wasn't just clothing, it was a performance, a statement of status and belonging. Imagine trying to wear a toga over a pair of woolly breeches. It would be an architectural nightmare, a fashion faux pas of epic proportions. The very aesthetic of classical attire was about revealing the silhouette, celebrating the body as a vessel for thought and action, not wrapping it up like some sort of uncomfortable sausage roll. You probably won't survive this fashion police raid if you show up in jeans. The term they often used for these leg coverings was brachy, a word derived from Celtic. And whenever you heard brachy, your mind immediately conjured images of the Gauls, the Germans, the Parthians, the very people Rome was constantly fighting against. It became an instantly recognizable identifier. Oh, look, a barbarian, he's wearing pants. It was less about the fabric and more about what that fabric represented. A world outside the Roman order, a lack of sophisticated social norms, a raw, untamed existence. These were the people who fought differently, spoke differently, and yes, dressed differently, often out of necessity rather than choice, to withstand colder climates or the rigors of horseback warfare. Exactly what those Scythian nomads understood so well. There's a quirky tidbit about Emperor Augustus, whose disdain for cold weather was so profound that he layered up with 4 tunics, a thick toga, and a pair of trousers beneath his cloak, all indoors. This, mind you, was Augustus, the very embodiment of Roman dignity. Yet even he, in the privacy of his own home, succumbed to the practical comforts of barbarian attire. It wasn't something he'd ever admit to publicly, of course, but it shows the internal conflict between cultural ideals and the undeniable reality of temperature control. It's like admitting you secretly enjoy a fast food burger after a week of gourmet dining. A necessary evil, perhaps, but certainly not something to boast about in polite society. Interestingly, as the Roman Empire expanded, especially into the colder, rainier climes of Gaul, Britannia, and Germania, their military encountered a practical dilemma. Those flowing tunics, ideal for the Mediterranean sun, were absolutely useless in a driving northern European blizzard. So, slowly, incrementally, some Roman legions began to adopt their own versions of brachy, often shorter, tighter versions that still allowed for movement, but offered crucial protection from the elements. This wasn't a sudden fashion revolution, mind you. It was a gradual, grudging concession to necessity. A soldier freezing his legs off in a German winter wouldn't care much for aesthetic purity. He just wanted to avoid frostbite. This evolution in military attire highlights a fascinating tension. The Roman civilian elite continued to look down on pants, associating them with the wild, uncivilized periphery. Yet the very soldiers who protected the empire, who expanded its borders, found themselves adopting the practical garments of their adversaries. Historians still argue whether the eventual adoption of brachy by some Roman legions was a purely practical decision born of necessity, or if there was a subtle, unacknowledged influence of barbarian style slowly creeping into Roman military fashion. A grudging acknowledgement that sometimes comfort and practicality trumped traditional notions of elegance. It was a slow, almost imperceptible cultural shift, driven by the blunt realities of conquest and climate, rather than any sudden appreciation for tailored legwear. For centuries, the classical world would cling to its bare-legged ideals, but the seeds of a new fashion sensibility, born out of the practicality of the barbarians, had already been sown. You're standing with a Roman legionary, shivering at the very edge of the empire, the wind whipping off the Rhine. Your toga, or even your humble tunic, feels entirely inadequate against the biting chill that seeps into your bones, while across the misty river, a figure emerges from the trees. They're tall, broad-shouldered, and their legs are encased in something practical, something that hugs the form, something decidedly un-Roman. You can almost feel the warmth radiating from the thick wool or leather, a stark contrast to your own goosebumps. This, my friend, is your first proper glimpse of what the Romans so readily dismissed as barbaric attire. And honestly, if you tried to survive a winter campaign in Germania in your standard Roman garb, you probably wouldn't survive this very narrative. For the Germanic and Celtic tribes, practicality wasn't just a preference. It was a matter of survival. While you, lounging in your sun-drenched villa, might scoff at the sight of anyone willingly encasing their lower limbs, these weren't people who spent their days reclining on triclinia. These were warriors, hunters, farmers, and nomads, constantly on the move, facing elements that would turn your delicate Roman sandals into frozen relics in mere minutes. Their answer: various forms of leg coverings that, while perhaps not always perfectly tailored in the way we envision modern trousers, served the same fundamental purpose: warmth, protection, and unparalleled freedom of movement. Think of the Celts, for instance, whose distinctive brays were a common sight across swathes of Europe, from the misty shores of Ireland to the rugged hills of Gaul. These weren't your tight-fitting jeans, mind you, but rather loose-fitting breeches, often cinched at the ankle or tucked into boots. Imagine the practicality. You could ride a horse for hours without chafing. You could stride through thorny undergrowth without scratching your shins to ribbons. And you could huddle around a meager fire without frostbite creeping into your toes. Compare that to the Roman legionary, whose short tunic often left his legs exposed to the elements, relying on his thick cloak for what little warmth it could offer. It's no wonder that, despite their initial disdain, Roman soldiers stationed in the colder provinces slowly, but surely started to go native. adopting the very trousers they once scorned. Call it fashion diffusion, call it common sense, call it finally admitting the barbarians had a point about leg warmth. The Germanic tribes, too, were masters of practical legwear. Their versions of trousers, often made from wool or animal hides, were essential for navigating the dense forests and icy rivers of their homelands. These weren't just simple wraps. Archaeological evidence, though sparse due to the perishable nature of textiles, points to surprisingly sophisticated tailoring for the era. Some were remarkably fitted, almost like early leggings, while others resembled more voluminous breeches. You can imagine a skilled tribal weaver, perhaps grumbling slightly about the constant demand for more leg coverings, but ultimately understanding their vital importance. It wasn't about looking fashionable in the Roman sense. It was about functionality, about blending seamlessly with an environment that demanded constant adaptation. This brings us to a fascinating point, the cultural lens through which clothing is viewed. For the Romans and Greeks, the exposed leg was a sign of civilization, of physical prowess, of a certain aesthetic ideal. To cover the legs, especially for men, was seen as effeminate, weak, or distinctly foreign, a hallmark of those unruly, uncivilized peoples beyond their borders. It was a visual shorthand, an immediate identifier. You wore a toga, you were a Roman. You wore trousers, you were probably someone they were trying to conquer, or at least someone they looked down upon. This cultural snobbery, however, ran headlong into the undeniable realities of Northern European winters. You can have all the philosophical debates about the nobility of the bare leg you want, but when your shins are turning purple from frostbite, a pair of woolly trousers starts looking mighty appealing. And it wasn't just the cold. Remember our discussion about the mobility imperative and the horseback riding revolution. These Germanic and Celtic tribes were often highly mobile, with equestrianism playing a significant role in their warfare and daily lives. Try riding a horse for an extended period in a tunic or, heaven forbid, a toga. You'd be chafed raw in places you didn't even know could chafe, and your modesty would be severely compromised. Trousers, on the other hand, provide a protective layer, prevent chafing, and allow for a secure, comfortable seat in the saddle. It's almost as if the steppes nomad's ingenuity, which we touched upon earlier, had a ripple effect, slowly but surely spreading westwards, proving its undeniable utility. Historians still argue whether the concept of leg coverings like brays and trousers arose independently in various European regions, or whether there was a consistent cultural diffusion from the East, perhaps influenced by the very Scythian fashion statements that first put proto-pants on the map. Was it an organic response to similar environmental pressures, a parallel evolution of necessity? Or was it a clear adoption, perhaps initially slow and then accelerating, as peoples encountered each other and saw the practical advantages of certain forms of dress? The truth, as is often the case with ancient history, is likely a complex tapestry of both, with local innovations blending with borrowed ideas. What is clear, however, is that these barbarian tribes, far from being unsophisticated in their attire, were incredibly pragmatic. Their clothing wasn't just about covering the body. It was about enabling their way of life. The thick, woven woolens, the durable leathers, the practical designs, they all spoke to a deep understanding of their environment and their needs. You see depictions of Celtic charioteers in their brays, Germanic warriors with their legs encased in what looks suspiciously like early leggings. And you realize that these were not just random garments. They were integral to their identity and their survival. It's almost amusing to think of the Roman elite, initially so dismissive, eventually succumbing to the undeniable logic of a good pair of trousers. Even the most ardent traditionalist, after a few miserable winters on the frontier, probably secretly yearned for the warmth and comfort of those barbarian leg coverings. The irony, of course, is that these despised garments would eventually become a staple of European dress for millennia to come, proving once again that sometimes common sense triumphs over cultural prejudice, even if it takes a few centuries for the message to sink in. Practicality over pomp. Discuss the tension between practical clothing needs and prevailing fashion norms. You stand on the windswept plains, the biting chill seeping into your bones, watching as a group of riders gallop past, their legs encased in what looks suspiciously like early trousers. Their movements are fluid, unhindered, as they seamlessly mount and dismount, their practical leg coverings offering protection from the elements and the chafing of the saddle. Now, shift your gaze. Imagine yourself back in the opulent, sun-drenched squares of ancient Rome, draped in a magnificent toga. It's an impressive sight, isn't it? The sheer volume of fabric, meticulously folded and draped, speaks of status, leisure, and a certain disdain for anything too utilitarian. You certainly wouldn't be riding a horse in that get-up, not unless you fancied a rather undignified unraveling. The practicalities of life, it seems, often clash head-on with the prevailing winds of fashion, and nowhere is this tension more vividly displayed than in the slow, reluctant adoption of pants. You probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes attempting to herd sheep in Gaul while wearing a pristine white toga, let alone survive a winter campaign on the Rhine. You'd be frozen, exposed, and probably tripping over your own dignity. Yet for centuries, that was the Roman ideal of dignified dress. A flowing, open garment that celebrated the unencumbered male form. A stark contrast to the tailored, leg-encasing garments favored by the very barbarians they sought to conquer or control. The irony, you'll find, is delicious. Remember those Germanic and Celtic tribes we talked about, with their leggings and proto-pants? To the Romans, their attire was the very definition of uncivilized. Wearing trousers was seen as a sign of effeminacy, a lack of manly virtue, and a barbaric concession to the elements that true Romans, presumably, simply willed away with stoic resolve. Imagine the Roman senator adjusting his toga, scoffing at a trouser-wearing Gaul. "Look at him," he might murmur to his compatriot, "clothed like a peasant or worse, a woman. Where is the noble drape, the expression of a free citizen?" It's a bit like someone today insisting on wearing a full ballroom gown to a monster truck, rally technically clothing, but entirely missing the point of the activity. But the world, as always, kept spinning, and the practical demands of empire building couldn't be ignored forever. As Roman legions pushed further north into colder climates, and as cavalry became an increasingly vital component of their military, the limitations of the tunic and toga became painfully apparent. Try charging on horseback for hours across frost-bitten landscapes with your bare legs exposed to the elements. You'd quickly realize that, while conceptually grand, the toga was about as useful for warfare as a chocolate teapot. The constant chafing, the vulnerability to cold, the sheer awkwardness of fighting in billowing fabric, it all pointed to one simple, undeniable truth. Pants, in their various forms, just made more sense. So here's a mainstream historical fact for you. Despite their initial disdain, the Roman military was one of the first Roman institutions to grudgingly adopt trousers. Necessity, they say, is the mother of invention, and in this case, It was the mother of sartorial compromise. Roman soldiers, particularly those stationed in colder frontier regions like Britannia or Germania, began wearing a form of trousers known as bracchi. These weren't the tight, tailored trousers we think of today, but looser, sometimes knee-length or full-length garments. They started as practical additions, often worn under the tunic, a bit like thermal underwear, only more visible. The Roman contempt for them didn't vanish overnight, but the chill of the north wind had a rather persuasive argument. The adoption wasn't uniform, mind you. Even within the military, there was a hierarchy of fashion. Senior officers, particularly those back in Rome, might still cling to the proper Roman dress, while the grunt on the frontier, shivering in a German forest, was just grateful for anything that kept his legs from turning blue. This leads us to a quirky tidbit. Some accounts suggest that even as bracchi became common among soldiers, Roman citizens back home would sometimes look down on legionaries who returned wearing them, seeing it as a sign that they had gone native or adopted barbarian habits. Imagine fighting for the glory of Rome for years, only to be judged by your fashion choices upon your return. It's like coming home from a long, arduous trip, only for your relatives to critique your travel outfit. Oh, you wore those shoes? I expected more from a conqueror of nations. The tension wasn't just about utility versus aesthetics. It was deeply intertwined with identity, culture, and even moral values. The toga symbolized the Roman citizen, his freedom, his place in society. To abandon it for the trousers of the barbarian was, for some, akin to abandoning one's very Romanness. Yet, as the empire expanded and incorporated more diverse peoples, and as the lines between Roman and barbarian became increasingly blurred, so too did the rigid fashion codes. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of trousers by Roman civilians was a gradual cultural assimilation, a top-down military directive, or simply a grudging concession to comfort as the empire's climate grew cooler and its borders expanded. It wasn't a single eureka moment where someone declared, "Right, chaps, trousers it is." It was a slow, creeping shift, driven by pragmatic needs on the periphery of the empire that eventually seeped into the heart. You can almost hear the grumbling. "Honestly, another freezing winter. My dignity is no match for frostbite. Perhaps just this once we'll wear those things." And so, piece by painful piece, the armor of fashion began to crack under the relentless assault of practicality. The idea that clothing should first and foremost be comfortable and functional, rather than a mere symbol of status or adherence to strict societal norms, was a radical one in a world where appearances often dictated one's place. But as those chilly winds blew, and as the horses needed riding, the humble leg covering, once scorned, began its long, triumphant march towards ubiquity. You know, you're trudging through the misty, chill forests of Germania, the kind of damp, bone-seeping cold that makes your teeth chatter so hard you worry they'll shatter. The breath plumes from your lips like tiny, hurried ghosts, and your fingers, curled around the cold steel of your pilum, are starting to feel less like digits and more like oddly shaped blocks of ice. You're a Roman legionary, proud wearer of the iconic tunic, that knee-length, often red wool garment that just screams civilized and prepared for Mediterranean sunshine. But out here, in this perpetual gray drizzle, with the mud clinging to your calves and the biting wind whipping up under your short tunic, you're starting to reevaluate your fashion choices. You eye the local barbarians, those Germanic tribesmen with their shaggy hair, and dare you think it, their utterly practical leg coverings. They call them bracchi, or something similar, These strange, baggy trousers that seem to offer an actual, tangible barrier between their skin and the soul-crushing cold. And suddenly, your toga-clad ancestors' disdain for such uncivilized garments feels less like a mark of superior culture and more like, well, a recipe for hypothermia. And let's be honest, you probably won't survive this if you insist on showing off your knees. Yes, for centuries, the Roman attitude towards trousers was one of profound, almost theatrical, sneering. You remember how the Greeks and Romans initially viewed these leg wrappings as the attire of barbarians, effeminate Persians, or rough-and-tumble Gauls. Your average Roman citizen, especially those of the patrician class, wouldn't be caught dead in anything but a tunic, or, for formal occasions, the glorious, cumbersome toga. To wear trousers was to renounce your Roman identity, to stoop to the level of those wild, uncouth tribes beyond the empire's carefully manicured borders. It was a matter of civic pride, a visual declaration of who you were, and emphatically who you were not. The very word for trousers, brachy, was adopted from the Gauls, further cementing their otherness in the Roman mind. But here's the thing about empires: they expand. And when you expand into places like the cold, wet, densely forested northern reaches of Europe, or the windswept plains of Dacia, or even the wild, untamed highlands of Britannia, suddenly cultural disdain starts to look a lot less appealing than functional warmth. The Roman army, ever the pragmatic institution when it came to conquest and control, began to quietly, almost reluctantly, reevaluate this long-held sartorial prejudice. You see, a tunic, while perfectly fine for parades in Rome or campaigning in the relatively mild climes of Italy, becomes a liability when you're slogging through knee-deep snow or battling through thorny thickets. Your legs, exposed to the elements, become numb, scraped, and dangerously susceptible to frostbite. Imagine trying to maintain formation or execute a complex maneuver when your lower extremities are screaming in protest. It's not exactly conducive to maintaining the Pax Romana, is it? Moreover, as the empire grew, so did the importance of its cavalry. You remember those steppe nomads, those equestrian masters who practically lived on horseback. Well, Rome encountered more and more such horse-borne foes, and sometimes even recruited them. And when you're spending hours upon hours in a saddle, a loose, flapping tunic is not just uncomfortable, it's a veritable chafing machine. The constant friction between your exposed skin and the horse's flank, or the leather of the saddle, would lead to raw, painful sores. Trousers, on the other hand, offered a protective layer, reducing friction and providing much-needed warmth and support during long rides. It was a simple, yet profound, practical advantage. While historians still argue whether the initial adoption was driven purely by climate or equally by the growing reliance on cavalry, the outcome was undeniable. So gradually, subtly, the Roman army began to embrace the very garment they had once scorned. It started, as these things often do, with the auxiliary troops. These were the non-Roman soldiers, recruited from conquered provinces or allied tribes, who often served alongside the legions. Many of them, especially those from Gaul or Germania, would have already been accustomed to wearing trousers in their daily lives. It made perfect sense for them to continue doing so. They were, after all, fighting in the very terrain where trousers made the most sense. And as the legionaries, the core of the Roman fighting machine, saw their auxiliary comrades faring much better in the harsh northern winters, the practicality of brachy became increasingly undeniable. It wasn't an official decree handed down by some emperor on day one. mandating all legionaries swap their tunics for pants. No, it was a more organic, ground-up adoption, driven by necessity and observed efficacy. You start seeing visual evidence of this shift, not necessarily on the monuments in Rome itself, which tended to stick to idealized, traditional Roman imagery, but in more localized military art and archaeological finds from the frontiers. Soldiers depicted on tombstones or provincial reliefs gradually start sporting these leg coverings. At first, they might be worn under their tunics for warmth, a hidden concession to comfort. But slowly, they became a more visible, accepted part of the military uniform. By the late Roman Empire, trousers, specifically the brachy, were no longer a sign of barbarism within the military. They were standard issue, particularly for troops stationed in the colder northern and eastern provinces. They varied in style, from tighter fitting, almost legging-like trousers, to looser, baggier versions that cinched at the ankle. This shift highlights a crucial aspect of Roman military adaptability. While they valued tradition, they were ultimately pragmatic. If a barbarian innovation offered a tactical advantage, if it helped them conquer, defend, or simply survive better, they were willing to adopt it, even if it meant swallowing a bit of cultural pride. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most revolutionary, especially when your kneecaps are turning blue. You see, the evolution of clothing, even something as seemingly basic as pants, is rarely a straight line. It's often a pragmatic zigzag, bending to the harsh realities of climate, conflict, and the simple need to not freeze your bits off. You find yourself now, centuries after the legions marched, in a world that feels both familiar and utterly alien. The grand, structured empire of Rome has fragmented, dissolving into a patchwork of nascent kingdoms, duchies, and territories. The straight, paved roads of the Caesars are slowly crumbling, swallowed by encroaching forests and the relentless march of time. And with them, some of the sartorial certainties. The practical brachy that served the Roman soldier so well don't just vanish. They evolve, adapting to the shifting landscapes and the burgeoning societal structures of what we now call the Middle Ages. You're not quite in a land of full-blown, tailored trousers yet, but you are witnessing the crucial embryonic stage, a period where the concept of distinct leg coverings begins its long, winding journey towards the ubiquitous pants we know and love today. Imagine, if you will, the early medieval farmer trudging through muddy fields, or the artisan stooping over a workbench in a smoky workshop. Their primary concern, much like their ancient predecessors, is protection from the elements, freedom of movement, and let's be honest, a modicum of warmth. The long, flowing tunics and cloaks are certainly elegant, perhaps even a bit dramatic in the flickering torchlight, but they leave your lower half exposed to the chill, the brambles, and whatever delightful surprises the medieval ground has to offer. This is where the concept of the hose begins to truly solidify its place in the everyday wardrobe. Not a single garment, mind you, but often two separate, tube-like coverings, one for each leg, pulling on like very long, very thick socks. They are the direct descendants of those earlier leg wraps and proto-trousers, simplified and made more adaptable for a world that's constantly in motion. You see them everywhere, if you know where to look. They are often made of wool, coarse and undyed for the common folk, providing essential insulation against the damp European winters. For the slightly more affluent, linen might make an appearance, offering a bit more comfort in warmer months, though comfort is a relative term when you consider the sheer lack of bathing facilities and the constant battle against fleas. You're walking around in two tubes of fabric, often tied to a belt or a short undergarment called a braise around the waist. There's no elastic, no fancy stretch material, just good old-fashioned fabric, cut and sewn with varying degrees of skill. And let me tell you, if you were to somehow teleport back to this era, expecting to survive even a single day without some serious discomfort, well, you probably won't survive this. Not without a major reevaluation of your personal hygiene standards and an acceptance of constant itching. This is a mainstream historical fact. The widespread adoption of hosen across various social strata in medieval Europe, from the peasant to the prince, albeit with distinct differences in quality and cut. The wealthy would have their hosen made from finer wools, perhaps even silk, dyed in vibrant, expensive colors, often fitted tightly to the leg, showcasing the wearer's physique. You might even see them in 2 different colors, one for each leg. A fashion choice that probably seemed incredibly daring at the time, but would make you look like a misplaced jester today. This distinct separation of leg coverings marked a significant departure from the unified, tunic-style garments that had dominated earlier eras, moving closer to the bifurcated leg, where that would eventually become trousers. The quirky, perhaps slightly gross, fringe tidbit about these medieval hoses is how often they were worn. Daily, yes. Washed daily, not so much. Laundering was a laborious task, involving harsh soaps and cold water, so garments, especially woolens, were typically aired out or brushed rather than regularly washed. Imagine the accumulated grime, the aromas. It's enough to make you truly appreciate modern sanitation. You can practically smell the centuries of unwashed wool and the faint, persistent tang of humanity, a scent that still clings to old tapestries in forgotten corners of museums. And yet this was simply how things were. Everyone was in the same boat, or rather, the same unwashed hosen. As the medieval period progresses, you start to see more sophisticated methods of attachment. Initially, simple strings or thongs might tie the top of the hose to the wearer's belt or the aforementioned braise. But later, particularly in the later Middle Ages, points emerged small laces with metal tips that would thread through eyelets on the hose and corresponding eyelets on the doublet or jacket worn over the braise. This allowed for a much more secure and fitted appearance, making the hose a more integral part of the overall ensemble, rather than just a pair of glorified leggings. It also made getting dressed a bit of a strategic operation, requiring a certain finesse to get all your points properly tied. Think of it as the original struggle with a tricky zipper, but multiplied by a dozen or more tiny laces. Historians still argue whether the transition from simple leg wraps to true, tailored hosen was primarily driven by evolving fashion sensibilities, the increasing prevalence of horseback riding, or simply the pragmatic need for greater warmth and mobility in a climate that could be brutally cold and wet. It's likely a blend of all three, a slow, organic evolution shaped by the daily needs and desires of millions of individuals across a continent. The horse, as we've seen, played its role, but so too did the slow, steady advance of tailoring techniques, allowing for garments that hugged the body more closely and offered less drag. You can almost feel the chill wind whipping around your calves as you stand in the market square, making the decision between a loose, billowy tunic and the snug, comforting embrace of a well-made pair of wool hosen. It's an easy choice, really, when you're facing a long, damp winter. And then, as the centuries tick by, the hosen begin to creep higher and higher, covering more and more of the upper thigh, eventually merging with the braise to form what we recognize as full-length, joined leg coverings. The lines between separate hose and what we would eventually call trousers blur, slowly, imperceptibly at first, until one day, you realize you're no longer looking at two distinct pieces, but a unified garment. It's a subtle shift, but one that lays the groundwork for the leg-focused fashion revolution that's still to come. The medieval period, often caricatured as static and unchanging, was in fact a cauldron of constant, practical innovation when it came to dressing for survival and increasingly for style. You've seen the Roman legionaries finally ditch their togas for practical trousers, and now you're strolling into the European medieval period where fashion, well, it gets a bit segmented. Because beneath those snug medieval hoses we just talked about, there was often another layer. A foundational layer, you might say, for the truly dedicated dresser. Imagine for a moment you're standing in a chilly, drafty medieval chamber. There's no central heating, obviously, and probably a distinct lack of proper insulation. If you had to live here for any extended period, let me tell you, you probably wouldn't survive this. Your phone would be dead, your latte would be frozen, and your concept of personal hygiene would be, well, quite different. But in this challenging environment, people still had to get dressed. And their first port of call, their very foundation, was something called brays. These weren't your sleek, modern boxer briefs, oh no. Picture a pair of loose-fitting, often knee-length or mid-calf linen shorts. They gather at the waist, secured by a simple drawstring. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of your most comfortable, slightly oversized athletic shorts that you refuse to throw out, even though they're probably older than your pet. Except these were designed not for a Sunday lounge, but for a full day of arduous labor, or perhaps a spirited joust, depending on your social standing. The primary function, modesty, pure and simple. You see, tunics could ride up, and a gentleman, even a peasant gentleman, required a certain level of decorum, especially when engaging in activities that might expose a bit more leg than polite society deemed acceptable. But beyond modesty, brays served a crucial hygienic purpose. In an era before daily showers were the norm, and outer garments were rarely washed, brays acted as a critical barrier between the body and the more expensive, harder-to-clean wool tunics and hoses. They were made predominantly from linen, a wonder fabric of the medieval world. Linen, as you might recall from our earlier chats about ancient textiles, is breathable, relatively easy to clean. For the time, that is, and quite durable. You could, in theory, boil your brays, scrub them with lye soap, and hang them out to dry, hoping the local magpies didn't abscond with them for nest building. This made them indispensable. They were the original washable layer, absorbing sweat and grime, protecting the outer garments from becoming too aromatic too quickly. Then there was the comfort factor. Walking, riding, fighting. All these activities could lead to chafing if your outer woolens were directly against the skin. Brays provided a soft, inner layer, a kind of primitive anti-chafing solution. And in those perpetually cool medieval dwellings, or out in the elements, they offered an extra, albeit light, layer of warmth. You might scoff at a thin layer of linen, but when every degree counts, it makes a difference. Historians still argue whether the term, brays, encompassed the entire evolution of men's undertrousers throughout the medieval period, or if distinct regional terms and styles warrant separate categorization. What's clear is that from roughly the 10th century onwards, this foundational garment was a staple. Initially, they were very loose, almost baggy, fitting the general silhouette of early medieval fashion where layers were king, and a less tailored look prevailed. Imagine yourself trying to sprint across a field in what essentially amounts to a linen sack tied at your waist. Not ideal for record-breaking times, perhaps, but perfectly functional for daily life. As the centuries marched on, and fashion began its inexorable march towards tighter, more form-fitting garments, especially for men's legs, braids underwent their own subtle evolution. They started to become slightly more tailored, less voluminous, adapting to the increasingly slender lines of the outer hoses. The relationship between braids and hoses was symbiotic. The hoses, often separate pieces of fabric for each leg, needed something to attach to. Enter the braids, or more accurately, the belt worn over the braids. The hoses would be tied or points, laces attached to the braid's waistband or a belt, keeping them from slouching down around your ankles. It was a bit like a pre-suspender system, ensuring your medieval pants stayed exactly where they were supposed to be. This layered system wasn't just about fashion or a lack of advanced tailoring. It was intensely practical. If one hose got torn or muddy, you only needed to repair or wash that single leg. If the weather changed, you could adjust layers. A quirky tidbit for you. While we might imagine medieval people as universally grubby, there were certainly efforts at hygiene. The fact that braids were made of linen and were considered washable indicates a conscious effort to keep at least some part of one's clothing clean. Though by clean, we often mean less dirty than before, rather than sparkling white. And while modern underwear has a distinct front and back, many early braids were designed quite symmetrically, meaning you probably wouldn't accidentally put them on backwards. A small mercy in a world full of larger challenges. So next time you effortlessly pull on your favorite pair of jeans or sweatpants, take a moment to consider the humble braids. They might seem rudimentary, even a little comical by today's standards, but they were a crucial step in the long, winding, evolutionary path of leg coverings. They tell a story not just of clothing, but of daily life, of hygiene in a challenging age, and of the incremental, practical innovations that slowly but surely led us to the pants you're probably wearing right now. From these loose linen shorts, worn under layers of wool, the seed of modern trousers continued to germinate, slowly but surely paving the way for the tailored garments you take for granted today. They truly were the quiet heroes of medieval wardrobes, ensuring that even if you were charging into battle or just mucking out the stables, you had a decent foundation. And let's be honest, who doesn't appreciate a good foundation? You stand there, perhaps in a bustling medieval market, or maybe within the hushed grandeur of a Renaissance court. The air hums with whispers, not just of commerce or court intrigue, but of clothing. Every fold, every stitch, every shade of color on the legs around you screams a silent message. It's a language you instinctively understand, even if you've never seen it codified in a grammar book. You glance down at your own hose, perhaps a simple, sturdy wool, practical for the muck and mire of the day, but telling of your common station. Then your eyes drift upwards to the approaching figure. You don't need to be told they're important. Their legwear announces it with an almost audible flourish. Imagine, for a moment, the shift from those humble braids we discussed, the functional undergarments, remember? To something far more ostentatious, far more deliberately eye-catching. We're moving beyond mere practicality now. Yes, the Romans eventually embraced trousers for their army, valuing their warmth and freedom of movement, and the medieval hoses kept your legs from freezing during those long, brutal winters. But as society became more stratified, so too did the attire covering your lower limbs. You see a nobleman approach, his legs encased in hose of the finest, most vibrant scarlet wool, perhaps even silk, imported from distant lands. The sheen catches the flickering torchlight, a stark contrast to the dull browns and grays that dominate the crowd. This isn't just about keeping warm anymore. It's about radiating wealth. That crimson, for instance, likely came from cochineal, a tiny insect whose crushed bodies produced a dye so intense and so costly, it was practically liquid gold. You just had to hope you didn't spill your medieval ale on it, because getting that stain out would be a whole different kind of costly. His hose are cut with an almost indecent precision, clinging to the calves and thighs, showcasing the musculature beneath. This wasn't always the case, of course. For centuries, leg coverings, when they existed beyond wraps, were often loose and baggy. But as the medieval period waned and the Renaissance dawned, tailoring became an art form, and the male silhouette began to emphasize the legs. The tight-fitting hose became a canvas, not just for color, but for texture. Velvet, with its rich pile, shimmered. Brocade, woven with intricate patterns of gold and silver thread, practically announced the wearer's lineage before they even spoke. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact: sumptuary laws. You might think fashion police are a modern invention, but oh no, they've been around for centuries, and they were particularly keen on legwear. These laws, enacted by rulers and city councils across Europe, dictated what materials, colors, and styles of clothing individuals of different social classes were permitted to wear. The idea was to prevent the lower classes from imitating the upper classes, thereby blurring the lines of social hierarchy. If you were a commoner caught sporting silk hose, you could face fines, public humiliation, or even imprisonment. It was a clear, unambiguous message. Know your place, peasant, and dress accordingly. It was almost as if they were saying, you probably won't survive trying to look richer than you are, without actually saying it, of course. They just let the constables do the talking. Consider the embellishments. While your humble hose might have been plain, a nobleman's could be embroidered with heraldic devices, pearls, or even small jewels. Imagine the weight, the sheer impracticality of walking around with what amounted to a small fortune stitched to your calves. But practicality was hardly the point. The point was to demonstrate that you could afford such impracticality, that your wealth was so vast you didn't need to worry about mud or snagging a priceless thread. It was the medieval equivalent of wearing a watch that costs more than a house, just to tell time. And then there were the shoes, or rather, the elongated toes of the period, known as poulains. While not strictly legwear, their length directly influenced the cut and drape of the hose, creating a continuous, elegant line from hip to toe. The longer the toe, the higher your status. Some poulains reached absurd lengths, so long they had to be tied to the knee with a chain to prevent tripping. Can you imagine trying to navigate a muddy street, or even just a set of stairs, with what felt like two small boats strapped to your feet? It was a quirky tidbit of fashion that speaks volumes about how far people would go for status, even if it meant risking a spectacular face plant. But historians still argue whether these sumptuary laws were truly effective in stemming the tide of fashion imitation. Did people really stop wearing what they wanted? Or did they just get more creative in flouting the rules? Did the wealthy truly feel protected by these decrees? Or did they simply spur a cat-and-mouse game of sartorial one-upmanship? Perhaps the desire to emulate the elite was simply too strong, a testament to the enduring human fascination with status. You see it, too, in the subtle distinctions of fabric quality. Your wool might be coarse, itchy even, but a wealthy merchant's wool hose would be so finely woven, so soft to the touch, it would feel almost like a second skin. They were often fulled and napped to a luxurious finish, indicating a level of craftsmanship and expense far beyond the reach of the average person. The very act of touching one's own leg could be a reminder of one's place in the world. The smooth, cool feel of silk against the skin, compared to the familiar scratch of rough homespun. And it wasn't just men. Though men's legwear evolved into what we recognize as trousers, women's long gowns often concealed leg coverings. Yet beneath the skirts, the quality of their stockings and underhoses, if visible at all at the ankle or peeking from a high-cut shoe, also whispered tales of status. Fine linen, intricately embroidered bands, or even silk stockings were a sign of a lady's refinement and her family's wealth, even if rarely seen by the casual observer. It was a private luxury, a testament to an inner world of opulence. It's like wearing your most comfortable yet most ridiculously expensive pajamas just for yourself. Pure indulgence. The form itself also spoke volumes. Consider the rise of the codpiece in the 15th and 16th centuries. Initially a practical flap to cover the opening of men's hose, it quickly ballooned into an exaggerated, padded, and often elaborately decorated protrusion. It wasn't just a modesty panel. It became a blatant, almost comical symbol of masculinity, virility, and status. The larger and more embellished the codpiece, the more powerful and important the wearer was assumed to be. It was the ultimate look at me accessory for your nether regions. So as you watch the parade of legs pass by, you realize that pants in their various incarnations were never just about keeping warm or allowing mobility. From the moment they moved beyond basic necessity, they became a canvas for aspiration, a billboard for one's place in the pecking order. They were a declaration, whispered or shouted, of who you were, what you had, and where you belonged in the intricate tapestry of society. Global legwear innovations briefly touch upon independent developments of trousers in East Asian cultures. You shift in your imaginary bed, perhaps a touch relieved that we've finally left the rather stuffy classical world behind and skipped past the brambles of medieval Europe. You've seen how necessity birthed leg coverings in the West, driven by the biting cold and the gallop of a horse. But as the sun rises, or rather, sets for your sleepy brain on the other side of the world, you find an equally compelling, equally independent story unfolding. Imagine, if you will, the vast, windswept plains of Central and East Asia, where the very air hums with a different kind of ancient wisdom, a wisdom that also pointed directly to pants. You're not in a Roman villa anymore, my friend. Instead, you feel the dust of the steppe clinging to your skin, or perhaps the dampness of monsoon season on ancient rice paddies. The landscape shifts dramatically, from the Gobi Desert to the fertile valleys along the Yellow River, and with it, the answers to our timeless question: who first decided to wear trousers? Turns out, plenty of people, often simultaneously, thousands of miles apart, because really a chill breeze up your, well, you know, is a universal discomfort. Here, in the sprawling tapestry of East Asian cultures, the story of legwear innovations is equally rich, independently arising from similar practical needs. Think about the relentless demands of a life dictated by vast distances, by riding, by the ever-present threat of a splinter or an especially aggressive mosquito. Seriously, those ancient mosquitoes were probably the size of your thumb. And if you think you'd survive a week without leg protection against them and their disease-ridden brethren, you probably won't survive this history lesson. They were a force to be reckoned with, truly. You see early forms of leg coverings emerge from the prehistoric mists of regions like what is now modern-day China. Not always the fully tailored, bifurcated garments we think of as trousers immediately, but certainly steps towards them. Long before Julius Caesar was complaining about barbarian breeches, certain populations here were already experimenting with ways to protect and free their lower limbs. For instance, archaeological evidence, particularly from sites like the Xiaohe Cemetery in Xinjiang, Western China, has yielded astonishingly well-preserved early examples of trousers, dating back roughly 3,000 years. These aren't just scraps. We're talking about finely woven woolen trousers, clearly designed for active use, possibly for horseback riding by the local nomadic peoples. This mainstream historical fact underscores that the basic concept of leg coverings was being refined across continents, not just imported. Now, picture yourself living in a society where your very survival depended on your horse. You're galloping across enormous distances, hunting, herding, raiding. Every twist, every turn, every sudden stop would be absolute torture if you were wearing something akin to a Roman toga, or even the most rugged of tunics. The friction, the chafing, the sheer indignity of trying to dismount gracefully after a long ride in anything but fitted legwear. It simply wouldn't do. So, the horse-riding revolution, as we discussed previously with the Scythians, wasn't confined to a single geographical hotbed. It spurred parallel innovations in legwear across Asia, from the steppes stretching into Mongolia down into the heartlands of China. The independent development isn't merely about necessity, it's about localized ingenuity. Take the Chinese, for example. While they initially viewed the nomadic barbarians from the north with some disdain, they quickly adopted their effective military innovations, including, you guessed it, trousers. The shift from flowing robes to more practical attire was notably spurred during the Warring States period c. 475–221 BCE, when states like Zhao recognized the tactical superiority of cavalry, dressed in trousers over their traditional chariot-based infantry, wearing cumbersome robes. It was a classic, if you can't beat 'em, join 'em, and steal their fashion ideas moment. This practical pivot was less about fashion and more about not getting trampled by someone wearing the right pants. It's a bit like deciding to wear sensible shoes for a marathon instead of your favorite sparkly heels. One choice leads to victory, the other to a very short, painful run. But here's a quirky tidbit. While the initial adoption might have been for military effectiveness, the type of trousers developed and used in different parts of East Asia varied wildly. In some regions, they were surprisingly baggy, almost like divided skirts, allowing for airflow in hotter climates. In others, they were more tailored, sometimes cinched at the ankle, evolving into styles that eventually influenced garments like the Japanese hakama, though hakama itself has a distinct lineage. Historians still argue whether the continuous evolution of legwear in certain East Asian cultures represents a purely independent trajectory, or if there were ongoing, subtle diffusions of ideas from Western and Central Asian nomadic groups that periodically re-influenced local designs. It's a chicken or egg scenario, only with more wool and fewer feathers. Think of the materials, too. While Europeans struggled with early wool and linen, East Asian cultures, particularly China, had access to silk. Imagine riding in silk trousers, not only incredibly comfortable and cool in warmer weather, but also a definite status symbol. You weren't just wearing pants, you were wearing silk pants. That's like showing up to a campfire in a three-piece suit made entirely of cashmere. Unnecessary, perhaps, but undeniably impressive. The craftsmanship involved in some of these ancient garments, with their intricate patterns and durable weaves, speaks volumes about the advanced textile techniques of these societies. It wasn't just about covering your legs. It was about doing it with style, even if that style was primarily defined by function. So, while the Romans were busy fretting about the impropriety of bifurcated garments, and medieval Europeans were figuring out how to keep their hoses from slipping down their shins, cultures across East Asia were quietly, efficiently, and independently perfecting the art of the trouser. They recognized, in their own unique contexts, that separating the legs was just a smarter way to move, to fight, and to survive the diverse challenges of their environments. From the vast, arid steppes where winds whip up dust storms, to the humid, often muddy agrarian fields, the trouser in its various indigenous forms proved its undeniable utility. And it's not just for riding, mind you. Imagine tending to crops, climbing a mountain, or chasing a rogue chicken while attempting to maintain your dignity in a flowing robe. It's a logistical nightmare. The East Asian legwear story is a testament to convergent evolution in clothing. Given similar problems, cold, chafing, mobility, people often arrive at similar solutions, regardless of how far apart they are. Tailoring techniques evolve. Discuss the advancements in sewing that allowed for more fitted garments. You lean closer, your eyes tracing the delicate line where two pieces of fabric meet, stitched together with an invisible precision that feels almost magical. You can almost hear the soft whisper of thread pulling through cloth, the rhythmic tap of a thimble against a needle's eye, the quiet snip of shears. Imagine the sheer concentration, the steady hand, the patience required to transform a flat, unassuming piece of textile into something that conforms, embraces, and celebrates the complex curves of the human body. Because, let's be honest, you're not a plank of wood, and getting fabric to lie nicely on anything but a plank of wood takes some serious skill. For centuries, clothing was, let's just say, functional. It draped, it wrapped. It was more about covering you than defining you. Remember those early human attires, born of necessity to shield against the elements? They were practical, yes, but often shapeless. Even the earliest forms of leg coverings, those proto-pants of the Scythians we talked about, were revolutionary in concept, but in execution. A bit baggy, a bit rustic. They got the job done, keeping the chill out and the chafe down, especially when you were galloping across the steppes on horseback. But they weren't exactly custom-fitted. Think of it less as a tailored suit and more as a very enthusiastic fabric sack with holes for your legs. But then something shifted. It wasn't a sudden eureka moment, not like discovering fire or inventing the wheel. It was far more granular, a slow, meticulous evolution of craft. The very act of sewing, for instance, underwent its own quiet revolution. For the longest time, you were probably making do with bone awls, pushing holes through hide, then lacing them together with sinew or tough plant fibers. Effective, certainly, but try making a neat seam with that. Then came the needles, first crafted from bone, then from bronze, and eventually the game changer, iron needles. Finer, sharper, stronger, they allowed for much tighter, more consistent stitches. It's like upgrading from a blunt crayon to a perfectly sharpened pencil. The possibilities for detail just explode. You wouldn't survive a day trying to mend your favorite t-shirt with a bone needle. Believe me. The sheer frustration alone would probably send you back to wearing leaves. With better needles came better understanding of the stitch itself. From basic running stitches to back stitches, whip stitches, and eventually interlocking stitches that created incredibly strong, almost invisible seams. This wasn't just about durability, it was about precision. When you can create a seam that doesn't bulk or pucker, you can start to think about shaping the garment itself. You start to understand how tension on the thread can draw fabric in, how different stitches can create different effects. It's like learning to sculpt, but with fabric and thread as your clay and chisel. Then there was the thimble. Oh, the humble thimble. Before its widespread use, your fingers were probably pincushions, perpetually pricked and sore from pushing stubborn needles through thick fabrics. The thimble, a simple cap of metal or even leather, allowed tailors to apply significant force to the needle without damaging their digits. This meant they could work with denser, more durable fabrics and execute more complex, multi-layered seams that held their shape. It's a small detail, but sometimes the smallest innovations have the biggest impact, allowing for more intricate work and less painful hands. Historians still argue whether the thimble's widespread adoption was a primary driver for more fitted garments, or merely a happy coincidence alongside other advancements. Was it the spark, or just more fuel for an already burning fire? But the real magic, the true unlocking of tailored garments, came with the understanding of cutting. Imagine your ancestor, still wrapping simple rectangles of fabric around their legs. Now, envision a tailor, centuries later, looking at a piece of cloth not as a flat plane, but as a three-dimensional puzzle waiting to be solved. They learned about the grain of the fabric, how it stretches in one direction, hangs in another. They started cutting curves, not just straight lines. They experimented with darts and pleats, folding and stitching fabric to create volume where needed, like over a hip or knee, and remove it where it wasn't. Think about a pair of well-fitting modern trousers. They aren't just tubes of fabric. They're shaped around your waist, curve over your glutes, narrow at the ankle. This shaping is achieved through precise cutting and seaming. Early tailors discovered that by cutting fabric on the bias, diagonally across the grain, they could create garments with more stretch and drape, allowing them to mold better to the body. This was crucial for achieving a snug, yet comfortable fit around the legs and waist. It's like going from drawing stick figures to rendering anatomical drawings, a completely different level of understanding and execution. For a long time, even when you had separate leg coverings like the medieval hoses we discussed, they were often simply cut, stitched, and then pulled on, sometimes needing lacing or tying to stay up. They might be relatively close-fitting, but they lacked the sophisticated shaping we associate with modern trousers. The advancements in tailoring meant that you could, for the first time, create a garment that truly hugged the leg, that moved with the wearer without bunching excessively or restricting movement. This wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about practicality. A well-tailored garment is less likely to snag, less likely to get in the way, and paradoxically more comfortable over long periods. It's the difference between wearing a sleeping bag and a second skin. This evolving mastery of needle, thread, and fabric manipulation meant that clothing could become more than just protection. It could become a statement, an extension of the wearer. You could finally create trousers that were not just functional, but flattering. And in a world where legwear was increasingly becoming a symbol of status, as we touched upon earlier, the ability to tailor them with precision became paramount. You wanted your legwear to show off your wealth, your physique, your good taste, not just your ability to wrap some fabric around yourself. It led to an arms race of sartorial excellence, with tailors vying to create the most intricate, most perfectly fitted garments. It probably meant a lot of very patient customers, and even more patient tailors, meticulously perfecting every seam. You feel the weight of velvet, the rustle of silk, as you stand in the bustling piazza of a Renaissance city. The crisp morning air, scented with fresh bread and the faint perfume of 1,000 newly washed garments, brushes against against your elaborately tailored leg coverings. Gone are the days of simple, utilitarian brays, those loose linen drawers you'd hide beneath your tunic, or even the snugly fitted but still rather plain hose that clung to your legs like a second skin. No, this new era, this explosion of art and thought and commerce demands something more. It demands a statement. It demands structure. It demands breeches. You look around and see a riot of color and fabric, men's legs no longer just limbs to be covered, but canvases to be adorned. This is the Renaissance, darling, and your legs are no longer just for walking or riding. They're for showcasing. Breeches, as they arrived on the scene, were a revolutionary departure. Unlike the continuous stretch of hose from waist to foot, breeches covered the body from the waist to just below the knee, or sometimes even to the mid-thigh. They were often voluminous, padded, slashed, and adorned with ribbons and embroidery. Imagine wrapping yourself in a small, stylish cloud. That's the general vibe. These weren't just tubes of fabric. They were engineered pieces of sartorial art, demanding an entirely new level of tailoring sophistication, a perfect evolution of those growing techniques we mentioned. Remember how we talked about tailoring advancing to create more fitted garments? Well, now it's gone from fitted to sculpted. The most iconic of these, perhaps, were the trunk hose, which exploded in popularity, quite literally. Picture a pair of short, puffed-up trousers that resembled a melon or a pumpkin, often worn over separate stockings. They were frequently paned, meaning they had strips of outer fabric, the panes covering a contrasting lining, revealing glimpses of the opulent silk or satin beneath. Sometimes they were so padded with horsehair, straw, or even rags, that you could barely walk through a narrow doorway. It was a true fashion flex, declaring, "Yes, I have so much spare fabric and stuffing, I can afford to look like a walking cushion." Historians still argue whether the extreme padding in some trunk hose was purely for aesthetic reasons, or if it served a practical purpose, perhaps offering some rudimentary protection in an era where public life was, let's just say, less than entirely civil. And speaking of civil, or rather survival, let me drop a little reality bomb on you. Trying to navigate daily life in a pair of heavily padded, elaborately slashed, high-maintenance breeches in, say, 16th century London with its open sewers and muddy streets, well, you probably won't survive this. Not the breeches, at least. One splash from a passing cart, and your meticulously puffed-out sartorial statement becomes a soggy, lopsided sponge. The sheer upkeep required for these garments was immense, a clear signal of wealth and status. Only those with servants to constantly clean, press, and restuff their legwear could truly pull off the look with consistent elegance. Then you have the Venetians, a slightly less exaggerated style, still full but tapering towards the knee, allowing for a more active silhouette. They were popular among gentlemen who perhaps needed a bit more freedom of movement than their trunk hose-clad counterparts. And for those who truly wanted to push the boundaries of leg-based excess, there were the Galligaskins, which were even larger and baggier than trunk hose, almost like exaggerated Dutch breeches, often extending to the knee and sometimes even gathered with a band below. Imagine balloon pants, but for aristocrats who wanted to look like they were perpetually ready for a dramatic, low-gravity leap. The sheer volume of fabric consumed for a single pair of galligaskins was staggering, a testament to the burgeoning textile industry and the disposable income of the elite. This shift wasn't just about covering your legs. It was about sculpting them, transforming them into a focal point of your entire ensemble. Remember how in medieval times, the quality of your hose could subtly signal your standing. Well, Renaissance breeches screamed it from the rooftops. The richer the fabric velvets, silks, damasks, the more elaborate the slashes revealing contrasting linings, the more intricate the embroidery, the higher you were on the social ladder. It was a visual shorthand for, I have arrived, and so have my incredibly expensive, possibly uncomfortable leg garments. There's a fringe tidbit about some particularly fashion-forward, or perhaps ill-advised gentlemen who would even have small bells sewn into the slashes of their trunk hose, creating a subtle jingle with every step. Imagine the cacophony at a crowded court. It would be like a perambulating Christmas tree, only in July. The arrival of breeches marked a significant point in the history of legwear, moving it firmly from a realm of pure practicality, even when it had status implications, into the realm of high fashion and deliberate self-expression. They were not just protective, they were performative. They weren't just worn, they were displayed. You weren't just putting on clothes, you were constructing an image. And this emphasis on construction, on tailored shapes and volumes, laid crucial groundwork for all future developments in menswear, pushing tailors to new heights of precision and artistry. It was a time when your legs stopped being just a means to an end, and became, instead, an end in themselves, at least from a stylistic perspective. This period truly solidified the idea that what you wore on your lower half could be just as, if not more, impactful than what adorned your upper body. And as the Renaissance faded into new eras, the spirit of these elaborate breeches, the spirit of deliberate fashion and tailored form, would continue to evolve, shaping the trousers and pants that would eventually become ubiquitous. But we'll save that for later. The Great Male Renunciation. Explore how pants became standardized, functional attire for men. You stand on the cusp of a profound sartorial shift, a revolution not of the guillotine, but of the trouser leg. Imagine, if you will, the bustling streets of late 18th century Paris, or perhaps the refined drawing rooms of London. You're looking at men, not in the voluminous breeches we just left behind. Those elaborate, often brightly colored, knee-length confections paired with silken stockings. No, something new is stirring. A quiet, almost imperceptible murmur that will soon become a roaring torrent, sweeping away centuries of male peacocking. You see figures, still adorned with powdered wigs and perhaps a lace cravat, but look closer at their lower halves. The fabric is darkening, the cut is lengthening, and a new silhouette is emerging, one that will define masculinity for centuries to come. And frankly, without this transformation, your chances of surviving the modern world, let alone comfortably navigating a subway turnstile, would be precisely zero. This, my sleepy listener, is the dawn of what historians rather grandly term the Great Male Renunciation. It's less a defiant throwing off of chains and more a gradual, yet utterly transformative shedding of finery, a deliberate step away from the dazzling, often impractical display that had characterized male aristocratic dress for so long. Remember those vibrant Renaissance breeches, sometimes slashed to show contrasting linings, embroidered with gold thread, or padded to an almost comical degree. Kiss them goodbye. This new era whispers of sobriety, of utility, of a deliberate downplaying of personal extravagance in favor of something altogether more serious. It's like discovering that your favorite sparkly unicorn t-shirt has suddenly been replaced by a sensible gray sweater, and everyone just agrees it's a better look. The forces behind this shift were manifold, swirling like a particularly complex cup of tea. Politically, the seismic rumbles of the French Revolution played a colossal role. The sans-culottes, the working-class revolutionaries, literally got their name from their rejection of the knee breeches, culottes of the aristocracy, opting instead for long trousers. This wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a political declaration, a visual rejection of privilege and a defiant embrace of the common man. Suddenly, breeches became a symbol of the old regime, and wearing them in revolutionary Paris could quite literally be a matter of life and death. Talk about fashion police with a firm hand. Economically, the burgeoning Industrial Revolution was also weaving its own influence. As society became more industrialized, as business and commerce took center stage, the need for practical, durable clothing became paramount. Imagine trying to operate heavy machinery in delicate silk breeches and stockings. It's simply not going to work unless your job is exclusively testing the tensile strength of thread with your teeth. Long trousers, often made of sturdier wool or cotton, offered greater freedom of movement, better protection, and a generally more sensible garment for the demands of a changing world. And then there was the incomparable figure of Beau Brummel. George Bryan Brummel, an English dandy and arbiter of fashion in Regency England, was not a revolutionary in the traditional sense, but his influence on male attire was arguably as profound as any political upheaval. Brummel championed an aesthetic of understated elegance, of meticulous tailoring, and of perfect fit, rather than ostentatious decoration. He famously spent hours on his toilette, but the result was a look that appeared effortlessly sophisticated. His dictum was simple: good tailoring, clean lines, and dark, functional fabrics. He favored dark blue or black coats and, crucially, long, well-fitted trousers. Brummel's genius lay in making sobriety fashionable. He made it cool to look like you weren't trying too hard, which, of course, took an enormous amount of effort. His influence spread like wildfire through the upper echelons of society, demonstrating that true style lay in subtlety, not in silks and frills. So you witness breeches, once the height of male fashion, slowly retreating into the realm of formal court dress, or, eventually, costume. Trousers, initially associated with laborers and revolutionaries, became the standardized attire for men of all classes. They were functional, yes, but also became a canvas for subtle expressions of wealth and status through the quality of the fabric, the precision of the cut, and the skill of the tailor. This was a shift from visual flamboyance to quiet distinction. You could no longer judge a man solely by the volume of his breeches, but perhaps by the crispness of his crease. This renunciation wasn't just about abandoning breeches for trousers. It was a fundamental redefinition of male identity in dress. Men were no longer expected to compete with women in terms of elaborate ornamentation. Instead, male dress became a symbol of rationality, industry, and seriousness. The focus shifted to the body beneath the clothes, implying a masculinity rooted in strength and capability, rather than in the superficiality of surface adornment. Historians still argue whether this shift was primarily an economic necessity driven by industrialization, a political statement born of revolution, or a purely aesthetic movement spearheaded by figures like Brummel. Perhaps like a perfectly tailored suit, it was a combination of all three, each seam contributing to the overall form. This new standard, however, created a striking divergence. Women's fashion continued to embrace color, ornamentation, and constantly shifting silhouettes, while men's attire settled into a remarkably stable, dark, and functional pattern that would dominate for over a century. It's almost as if men collectively decided, "Okay, ladies, you can have all the fun with fashion. We're off to invent the button-down." You settle further into the plush cushions of your hypothetical time machine. A faint hum now the only companion to the distant echoes of breeches and stockings fading into the sartorial past. You've journeyed through the ages, witnessing the evolution of legwear from necessity to statement, from the rudimentary hides of the early human to the structured elegance of the Renaissance. Now you stand on the precipice of an almost unimaginable shift, a moment when the once maligned, once exotic pant finally conquers the world. It's a quiet revolution, not with flags and trumpets, but with the subtle rustle of fabric and the soft clinking of belt buckles. Remember that great male renunciation we talked about, when men collectively decided that flamboyant fashion was for, well, other people. That was the starting gun. The 19th century dawns, and with it, the relentless march of industrialization. Factories rise, smokestacks pierce the sky, and suddenly the world isn't just about leisurely strolls in powdered wigs or dashing across battlefields in silken hose. No, you're working now, probably in a mill or building railroads or digging canals. You need clothes that move with you, that don't snag on machinery, that offer some semblance of protection from the daily grime. Imagine trying to operate a spinning jenny in a pair of delicate breeches. It's a recipe for disaster and probably a few embarrassing rips. This is where practicality truly begins its ascent to the throne of fashion. The working man, the backbone of this new industrial age, needs durable, functional attire. Denim, that sturdy cotton twill, born from necessity in American mines and ranches, starts its long, slow creep into the mainstream. It's tough, it's cheap, and it gets better with age, like a fine wine or perhaps a particularly stubborn block of cheese. Jeans, in their earliest forms, become the unofficial uniform of the laboring classes, a testament to their unyielding utility. You wouldn't survive a day on a 19th century construction site in anything less. But pants don't just stay in the factories and fields. Oh no. The influence begins to spread, like a particularly persistent dandelion in a perfectly manicured lawn. The rise of the middle class, with its burgeoning emphasis on respectability and sober efficiency, embraces trousers. They're seen as serious, professional, and unpretentious, a stark contrast to the aristocratic frippery of yesteryear. You start to see gentlemen in their offices, in their parlors, on their promenades, all sporting trousers. The cut might be different, the fabric finer, but the fundamental form is the same. It's a quiet nod to the dignity of work, even if your work is mostly signing papers and looking important. And let's be honest, it's far less complicated than trying to coordinate an entire ensemble of breeches, stockings, and ornate shoes. It's the sartorial equivalent of choosing direct deposit over a sack of gold coins. Simpler, less glittery, but far more effective. Then comes the early 20th century, and the world irrevocably shifts again. The First World War, a truly grim affair, inadvertently accelerates the process of pants' universal adoption. Soldiers, regardless of their pre-war social standing, wear trousers. They are practical, they allow for movement, and they are uniform. When these men return home, they bring with them a new understanding of what practical clothing means. The aesthetic of the uniform, the idea of a cohesive and functional garment, begins to permeate civilian life. Suddenly, trousers aren't just for labor, they are for everyone. Now, here's a quirky tidbit. Did you know that despite this growing acceptance, some elite private schools in England continued to enforce the wearing of traditional breeches or knickerbockers for boys well into the 20th century? It was a stubborn holdout against the tide of modernity, a last gasp of proper attire before the inevitable denim wave truly broke. Imagine being a teenager in the 1950s, desperate to look like James Dean, but being forced into something that looked like it belonged on a Victorian hunting party. The horror, it's enough to make you consider a career in, well, anything that involves less restrictive legwear. The roaring 20s arrive, and with them, a loosening of social norms and a bold new silhouette for women. While the flapper is often associated with shorter skirts, the burgeoning women's rights movement also saw the gradual, albeit slow, integration of pants into female wardrobes. Initially, they were for specific activities, cycling, riding, or daringly, for lounging at home. Hollywood starlets like Marlene Dietrich, openly embracing menswear, pushed the boundaries, making trousers a symbol of rebellious chic. It wasn't an overnight revolution for women, but the crack in the patriarchal sartorial dam had appeared. Historians still argue whether the functional needs of a changing world or the symbolic power of gender fluidity was the primary driver for women's eventual adoption of trousers. It's a fascinating chicken-and-egg question, really, though thankfully without any actual chickens or eggs. By the mid-20th century, the picture is clear. Pants are no longer a mark of a specific class or profession. They are ubiquitous. Think of the 1950s, the era of the suburban boom. Men in their pressed slacks, women starting to wear tailored trousers for leisure and even some work environments. The rise of pop culture icons further solidifies their status. Elvis gyrating in his tight trousers, the Beatles in their slim-fit suits, and eventually, the full-blown cultural phenomenon of blue jeans, transcending their working-class roots to become a global symbol of cool, rebellion, and comfort. You see them on construction workers, on college students, on movie stars, and even, eventually, on politicians, though perhaps not quite as tight as Elvis's. The universality of pants had been achieved. From the earliest hunter-gatherers seeking protection from the elements to the modern office worker sipping artisanal coffee, the leg-covering journey had reached its inevitable, comfortable conclusion. And so, here we are, at the very end of our winding journey through the fabric of time, through frozen steppes and bustling marketplaces, past galloping nomads and stoic Roman legions. You've seen how necessity, mobility, and even a dash of fashion pushed humanity, stitch by careful stitch, towards the familiar comfort of leg coverings. We've traced the story from its wispy origins, through functional prototypes, to the ubiquitous trousers you're likely lounging in right now. But after all this, after every thread pulled and every ancient seam examined, the enduring question remains, doesn't it? Who truly was the first to look at a chilly morning or a charging horse and think, right, I need something specific for these two appendages called legs? It's a deceptively simple question, isn't it? Almost childlike in its directness. Yet, as you've journeyed with me, you've probably noticed how history, much like that perfectly fitted pair of Renaissance breeches, is full of intricate seams and often, frustratingly, missing patches. We can point to the oldest physical evidence, absolutely. Those remarkable Tarim Basin mummies, lounging in their perfectly tailored wool trousers from over 3 millennia ago, stand as a testament to early sartorial genius. They are, for now, our earliest tangible proof, But proof of the first? That's where the whispers of the past become almost impossibly faint. Imagine trying to pinpoint the exact moment the first person decided to try and bundle leaves together to cover their nether regions, or perhaps the precise second someone thought, "You know, this animal hide would be a lot better if it wasn't flapping so much in the wind." It's like trying to find the very first raindrop in a thunderstorm. You just can't, can you? Early human ingenuity, particularly concerning survival, wasn't broadcast on ancient tick-tock, nor was it meticulously logged in stone tablets. It was iterative, organic, driven by immediate need. And frankly, if you were there, trying to figure out how to stay warm enough not to lose a limb to frostbite, you probably wouldn't be documenting your fashion breakthroughs. You'd just be trying not to, well, not survive this. The truth is, while we can marvel at the Scythian horsemen, those pioneering wearers of proto-pants, or consider the practicality of Germanic tribes' leggings in their frosty forests, what we're really looking at are moments of discovery or adoption within the archaeological record. We see the ripples, but the pebble that started it all, the original innovative spark, likely lies buried deeper than any shovel can reach. It's a testament to the incredible, often anonymous, genius of early humans, who, without patterns, without sewing machines, without even a basic understanding of textiles beyond what they could literally pull off an animal, figured out how to make something that worked. Historians still argue whether pants arose from a single point of origin in Central Asia and spread globally through migration and trade, or if multiple cultures, facing similar environmental and functional pressures like the need to ride horses, or simply stay warm, independently developed similar leg coverings over vast distances and time frames. It's a bit like the great pizza debate. Did it start in one place and spread, or did various cultures just coincidentally realize that flatbread with toppings was a good idea? Perhaps the concept of a distinct leg covering, a tube for each limb, was simply an obvious evolutionary step once humans mastered basic hide processing. You needed protection from thorns, from cold, from the chafing of horseback riding. A single sheet around the waist might work for a while, but eventually, someone somewhere in a moment of brilliant, practical insight thought, what if I close this gap? What if I separate these leg holes? It's this continuous, pragmatic problem-solving that defines so much of human innovation. We talk about the Roman army eventually embracing trousers, but before that, countless anonymous warriors had already discovered their tactical advantage on colder frontiers. We laud the tailors of the Renaissance for their breeches, but they stood on the shoulders of countless medieval craftspeople who perfected the hose. And so, as the very concept of trousers evolved, from simple hide wraps to intricate, tailored garments, the first becomes less about a specific person and more about a universal human drive to adapt and improve. It's a lovely thought, isn't it? That somewhere long, long ago, an unnamed pioneer, perhaps shivering on a vast, unforgiving plain or struggling to swing a leg over a horse without a wardrobe malfunction, had that quiet, profound realization. And from that moment, that simple, practical flash of inspiration, came the foundation for what you're wearing right now. It connects you directly to that distant past, to the fundamental human need for comfort, protection, and yes, even a little bit of style. Now, as the echoes of those ancient hooves fade, and the whispers of long-forgotten tailors grow soft, you find yourself here, cozy and warm, enveloped in the quiet hum of your own space. You've journeyed so far tonight, through thousands of years, across continents, exploring the subtle shifts and grand evolutions of something as seemingly simple as a pair of pants. It's a reminder that even the most ordinary things in our lives carry with them a tapestry of history, woven with countless threads of human ingenuity and necessity. Let your mind drift from the intricacies of ancient garments, from the rough hides and the fine silks, and settle into the soft comfort of your bed. The questions we've explored, the mysteries we've touched upon, don't demand answers now. They simply invite you to wonder, to appreciate the long, slow march of progress, the quiet innovations that built the world around you, stitch by painstaking stitch. Feel the warmth of your covers, the gentle rhythm of your breath. The grand sweep of history, with all its unsolved puzzles and quiet triumphs, is a calming presence, a lullaby whispered through the ages. Rest now, your own journey through the day is done. Sweet dreams,